so much, Yeshna. Let me try to share my screen now. So I hope you can see it now.
Yeah, it's perfect.
Okay. So thank you so much. So for the opportunity, it's a pleasure. So this is joint work with Lara, which is with us today, and with Susana Peralta. And so in this paper, we ask what was the impact of a large inflow of repatriates to Portugal in the late 1970s. And to answer this question, we use rich individual level data on all the repatriates that came back to Portugal and were living in Portugal in 1981. So we use this natural experiment to try to answer this question. And so this relies on it's very interesting because it relies on a large and concentrated inflow. So for you to have an idea, so this represents about 500,000 repatriates in a country that at the time had more or less 9 million people. And this inflow happened suddenly in just less than 2 years, between 1974, when there is a revolution in Portugal, but especially in 1975 and in 1976. So, and for identification, we rely not only on this natural experiment, but we use a shift share IV, which we believe that is a novel instrument in the literature, or a different instrument in the literature, because we are not exploiting past settlements as in other papers. What we are exploiting is the fact that these repatriates, most of them were born in Portugal. So we use their places of birth as an IV to try to predict where they are when they return. So if I don't have enough time, let me just quickly mention what we find. So we find substantial gender differences, with women suffering the bulk of the shock. So we observe that native workers are driven out of employment as employees. And there's a 22% decrease for males, but a huge decrease, about half of the females lose their job as employees. And while men compensate this loss as a job as employees by moving to low quality, and I'll define exactly what that is, low quality self-employment, women move to inactivity. So they basically leave the labor market. So let me try to say in a few words why do we believe that this is a very, very interesting case study to study the impact of Portuguese, the impact of migration in general in local labor markets. So I quote here two sentences from an article of the New York Times. So in the first one, the journalist wrote that the absorption of this mass of colonial refugees is one of the main difficulties facing Western Europe's poorest country. And they also say that the government, so the official refugee agency, is doing what it can to help the returnees, but it is admittedly overwhelmed. So this year's budget for refugees is about $4 million, but the agency is currently spending about $20 million a month in lodging, food, and welfare. So this is a huge effort, and has not only not solved the basic dilemma of how to integrate the refugees into national life, it has also stirred bad feelings among metropolitan Portuguese. So there are tales of refugees driving Mercedes, which they managed to ship out of Angola, yet living off of welfare checks and in luxury hotels at government expense. So this is a huge shock, and that's precisely what we are trying to exploit. So let me add other reasons why we believe that this is a very interesting case. So I argue that this is a large and concentrated inflow. So for you to have an idea, the repatriates increased the workforce per municipality on average by about 3.9%, and up to more than 15% in some municipalities. So for you to have an idea of comparison, and this is taken from a paper by Edo, the Pierre Noir in France, after the war in Algeria, they increased the workforce by 1.6. So we are talking about more than, in relative terms, more than the double. So the timing was largely unpredictable, so it's plausibly an exogenous source of variation. Other features that make this very interesting, so the return migrants were close substitutes to the natives. We define natives as those that did not migrate, but as we write here, most of the repatriates had been born in Portugal. So close to 80% of the repatriates were born in Portugal, and they left to Angola and Mozambique and other former colonies in the beginning of the 1960s and stayed there for 10 to 15 years. So moreover, the skill composition of repatriates, it's very interesting because, and different from other papers in the literature, what we have here is an inflow of people that are considerably more educated than the native population. I will show you a few facts about this, and it's not usual to find this kind of pattern. And finally, we do not have that much selection among migrants. So the large majority of the Portuguese that were registered in former African colonies, they repatriated to Portugal. A few went to South Africa, a few went to Brazil, but most of them, the large majority, they came back to Portugal. So we build on a growing literature, of course, since the seminal paper by David Card. Our paper is, and the experiment, the natural experiment that we are trying to exploit, has some similarities with those of the French Algerian, and there are two very well-known papers, very interesting papers by Jennifer and Anthony Edu, and in these for identification, we rely a lot on what Anthony Edu does, but we innovate in the fact that we are not using past settlements as an IV, but we are using these places of birth as our measure of to construct our shift share IV. And we contribute to a growing literature using natural experiments, including at least two fantastic papers that I've seen presented a few weeks ago in this very same seminar, looking at the impact of refugees from Venezuela to Colombia. So let me very quickly just say a few words of past economic papers in economics that have looked at these repatriates. So there is this paper by Carrington and De Lima in 1996. It's incredible to see that this was published in 1996 because they do a lot of trying to a lot of robustness tests. They are using very aggregate data and sometimes time series, but it's very, very interesting. So their findings are not very easy to put up together, but they find some adverse effects on wages and employment in 1975 when comparing regions in Portugal. There's this more recent paper in the European Economic Review by McKellar, and he uses synthetic control methods to try to see the impact of these refugees, and he finds significant adverse effects on productivity and wages between 75 and 85, but a very short run adverse effect on employment. So what we are able we contribute to this literature by being able to distinguish between the composition effects and the changes for the native population. So what they are using is basically regional or overall variation in the country, but they cannot separate between natives and repatriates. And we use individual level data on repatriates to overcome this issue. And our paper is also close to a paper by Ana Ruth Cardoso and Morin, and they are basically analyzing the period before, and just to highlight that Portugal, since there was a large period of a colonial war in Africa, and also some migration related to political events. Portugal was living in a dictatorship, so there was a skewed sex ratio. So the female labor force participation was particularly high in Portugal in the period before the retornados, the repatriates. So very quickly, just a few words on the historical background. So in the early 1960s and until 1974, there are some independence movement and starts a colonial war between Portugal and some guerrilla movements in Angola, Mozambique, and in Guinea-Bissau. For you to have an idea, this was a huge effort by the government. So in 1973, the military expenditures made up to close to half of the government expenditure. So uh, this was a huge effort. So in 1974, and basically as a response to this never-ending war, there is a military coup that put end to a dictatorship, and Portugal signs a peace treaty with independence movements in the colonies. But these peace treaties are not very well established, and then between 1974 and 76, there is a growing instability in these countries. Civil wars erupt, and close to 500,000 Portuguese that live in these territories, they decide to leave to Portugal. But this repatriation, as you can see, is completely chaotic. So there's a huge airlift, air bridge between these countries and Portugal. The Portuguese governments initiated large-scale programs to assist the repatriates in their arrival. I put here some numbers. So it's 11% of total government spending in 76, and it accounts for 5% of the Portuguese GNP in 74 and 70, from 74 to 76. The truth is that a few years later, when we have the data in 1981, this repatriation is considered a success story. But as we've seen in that media article by the New York Times and many other sources, there was a huge negative stereotyping from the natives to these repatriates. Repatriates were displayed in the media and in other places as stealing housing and jobs. So for you to have an idea, this large-scale program that the government put forward, so they basically rented all available hotels, sometimes even five-star hotels, because there was what was possible to rent at the time. So they rented basically all the hotels that they could. So they were also giving the incorporated everyone that was working as a civil servant in Africa, as in the civil service in Portugal. So there was a huge increase in the civil servants in Portugal, and they also granted small business loans to these repatriates so that they could start their jobs, their small companies. So regarding the data, so for the repatriates, we rely on a census on data at the individual level for this amount of repatriates in 1981. So and this was retrieved by sociologist Rui Pena-Pires. And so basically how the census measures if someone is a repatriate, they ask if they were living in Africa in December 1973. So the revolution was in April 74. So everyone that was living in Africa, and in 81 is living in Portugal, they consider to be a repatriate. And for these people, we have information on their age, their gender, their education, their place of birth, if it's in Portugal or in Africa, and if it's in Portugal, exactly in which municipality. And we have the place where they are living in 81. We also know where they were living in 79. And we show that the people moving regions from 79 to 81 is very small. For the natives, we rely on census data. This is aggregated at the regional level. And we have census data for 1960, which is the pre-shock, and for 1981. So the pre-shock before the war starts, and when a lot of people are going to Africa. And we rely on, and for the post-shock, we have data in 1981. Unfortunately, the data for 1970 or 70, it's just 10% of the, it's a small share. It's not very, it's low quality data. Then the unit of observation in our study. So for baseline, we are going to show you aggregated data at the NUTS-free regions. But for robustness, we also have, and there are basically 30. And for as robustness, we have we show the results that the results are robust if we use the 303 municipalities in Portugal. So for our outcome variables, which we measure separately for males and females, since we consider that they may not be very good substitutes in the labor market in this time. There is plenty of evidence by Edu and other people doing their analysis like this. So we are trying to measure their labor force participation, and the labor force participation is divided in the employment share and in the unemployment rate. For those that are employed, we can also observe the share that is employed as an employee, or those that are entrepreneur. And for entrepreneurs, we can also divide them between what we call high quality entrepreneurs. So if they are employers, if they have employees, and those that are self-employed. So this is just descriptive statistics, just for you to have an idea about the comparison between natives and repatriates. We call sample here because we are restricting to those above 15, but it's basically for repatriates and for natives, it's the universe of people above 15. But so we know that repatriates are more likely to be males. If we compare the education, for example, non-education, we see that the natives are far more non-educated than the repatriates. For example, the probability of repatriates being of higher education is twice the probability of being of natives of being of higher education. And also in these, we also show these for the outcome variables. So if they are working as employees or self-employed and so on. So regarding special cluster, the settlement of these repatriates across municipalities, we see that they are basically spread out in the country. It's not the case that, as in France, for example, they are only in the south of the country or in other. They are basically spread out over the country. So in poor regions, in Lisbon as well, in Porto. So there's a lot of variation, and so people that are coming back, it's basically the whole family. So most of the people that are coming back are males, but as you can see, in some nuts-free regions, this amounts to like 9% of more than 8% of the shock for males, and then for females, about 6%. So it's a huge shock. Again, we call it sample just because it's above 15.
So, João?
Yes.
May I just ask a clarification? What is the story behind the fact that they are more educated? Was it one of the reasons why they left, or they were encouraged to go in the colonies to start with? And do you have any idea of what kind of activities they were doing before coming back?
A few of them, let me start with the second question, is a little bit easier. A few of them were public servants. They had also their small businesses like repairs, electrician, plumbers, and they were like also working as clerks. And so these people were, there's a little bit of selection of who leaves, of course. They were entrepreneurial. It's at least the traditional wisdom that we have in migration literature, and also in this case, so that they were so these people that left were more educated, but also they had a few opportunities to study while in the colonies. Okay.
And there are just two questions by Jem on the chat, who was asking why also not looking at long-term effect in the 1990s and 2000, similar to what Edo is doing, and whether you have any idea of why they will settle in poor municipalities when they go back, or whether it's due to the network that they have.
So that's basically, let me also start with the second question. That's basically what we are trying to exploit in in the instrumental variable. I'm going to show you that most of them, they do return for the place where they were born. We plan to do more work to try to understand exactly if there are some kind of selection in those that decide to return and come back to the same place. For the first question, if we can measure something long term, unfortunately, we are not able to separate. We can do it at the regional level, but we cannot separate repatriates from natives in in 1991 or in 2001. So that's why we stop in 1981. Nevertheless, 1981, we think that it's a reasonable time for the labor market to adjust. So there was considerably, so there were a few years, there was a lot of things going on. We are going to discuss that at the same time, but it was a few years later that we are measuring these effects. So we think that this is representative of the long term, or at least the medium term.
Thank you, great.
Okay. So in terms of the methodology, so what do we do? So our dependent variable is the change in outcomes. So for all these outcome variables that I just showed you, between 1981 and 1960 for nuts for region N and nuts to N, and for region R. Okay, and region could either be nuts 3, for which we have 30, and this is very much what you could think about these regions as local labor markets. But we can also go to a smaller level, to the municipality. Instead of 30, we have 303. And our beta is our coefficient of interest. So we are trying to understand what is the impact of a labor supply shock that is due to migration. And we are able to control for a vector of pre-shock controls like education, share of young people, share of old people, and a few other things. So you could be worried for at least 2 reasons about this measure. The first one is that, so this is the ratio between repatriates and natives, and this could be because repatriates, they select into better places, so there is endogeneity for repatriates. And the second reason, it could be that natives answer, so they move in response to this labor supply shock. So we need to predict both. We need to predict repatriates, and we do so using the places of birth. And we also need to predict the location of natives, and we do so from using the spatial distribution in the pre-shock period, so in 1960. So, so I'm going to present you three variations of a shift share that we would like to have your opinion on. So the first one is very much based on, it's inspired by the work of Edo, and what we have here is so we construct this shift share. Instead of using past settlements, we use the places of birth for so the share of Portuguese born in for 4 educational groups in region, for 4 educational groups I in region R. Okay, and the idea is that there are some kind of network effects between the more educated. So if more repatriates of a certain education group were born in a particular period, we predict that in a given region, we predict that this region is able to attract more people in this education group. And the second one, we transform this IV, but instead of using the educational group, we use the origin. The origin, there are 3 origin groups that we are able to disentangle. One of them is if they are coming from Angola, if they are coming from Mozambique, or if they are coming from the other colonies. They could be either be Guinea-Bissau, Cape Verde, or Saint Tomé and Príncipe. So what we are basically arguing is that if there are a lot of people that went to Angola from a region, this region is predicted to receive, to attract more of these people when they have to come back. And we use this shift share, and for both these shocks, we use the repatriates for these educational groups as the shift. We also relax this assumption. Instead of using these as the shift, we can also use the white residents in colonies. So from in 1970, that was collected by the Statistics Institute. So not all of the people that were registered in these countries came back to Portugal. More than 90% did, but some went to South Africa or Brazil. So we are basically trying to use another shift to see if our results hold, and we are going to show you that the results are very, very similar with all these three IVs. So the final thing that remains to do before we are able to construct this shift share is to predict the location of natives. And for that, we use for each of the four educational groups, the share of each of these four educational groups per region, and we do it in we multiply by the shift of these natives per educational group. As a robustness, we also show that we use the natives as measured in 1960, and our results pretty much hold without instrumenting for this. Well, with all of that, we are finally able to construct our shift share instrument, which is basically just the share of these two predictions. So a few assumptions that we need to take into consideration for this to be a valid IV. So the places of birth of repatriates do affect, so it's a strong predictor of the subsequent settlement decision upon return. And I want to show you that that is indeed the case for each of the next two regions. There's a higher probability if there are more people leaving from this region, so they have a higher probability of attracting more people. Another assumption is that these should be exogenous to outcomes after controlling for several pre-shock characteristics. That's what we try to do with our set of controls. There is a sufficient time lag in favor of this to happen, and we rely on some work by sociologists to try to argue that these repatriates are a very socially diverse population. So it's true that some left Portugal to escape poverty, but some were from very rich settler families with affinities to colonial power. So it's a very diverse group that is coming back in 1974, and 75 and 76. Okay, so I'm just, are there any questions regarding the method, or should I? Okay, I'll show you the results. So what we find, and we'll do separately for males and females. Let me start with males, which are the bulk of most of the repatriates were males. So in terms of the change in the labor force participation, we do not see anything going on. We do not see anything going on in terms of unemployment rate or in terms of employment share. What happened is the following. So they left, so in places with more repatriates, native males, they left their job as an employee and they had to become an entrepreneur. But they were not high quality entrepreneurs that we measured as being employers. So they were able to compensate for this loss as an employee by opening their very, very small business, by doing some small works on the side and working as a self-employed. So it's basically people, they were able to circumvent this issue by becoming a low quality entrepreneur. And this is, so in the first column, we have the OLS with no controls, then we do add the controls. And if we, for all the three IVs, so this one is based on the education groups, this one is based on the origin from where they escaped Africa. And the last one is using shift, instead of using the repatriates per educational group, using people that were living in former African colonies in 1970. the results are very robust to all these three IVs. What happened with the females? So females, they basically left. So when we argue that they suffered the bulk of the shock, so they basically, in places with more repatriates coming, they basically left the labor market. So their labor force participation reduced, but unemployment did not increase. So it's just that the employment share decreased. Okay, so they basically left the labor market. So they are not. So they are not more. They leave their job as an employee, working as an employee, but they are not able, contrary to men, they are not able to compensate by becoming self-employed. Okay, now we try to show that our results are robust to several concerns that you may have. Let me start with the first. So all of these results are based on 30 observations. So you could be worried that there are kind of, so it's a small sample, this is our preferred specification because it accounts for spatial spillovers in times of like trying to have a local labor market. But nevertheless, if we run our specifications at the municipal level, and instead of 30, we have 303 observations, our results hold for males and females. And you would expect, if there are some kind of spillovers, you would expect that the labor market, so the impact on the labor market would be, so there would be some kind of attenuation bias. But what we find, if we run at the municipal level, is that the results are even more negative. If anything, they are very similar, but if anything, they are even more negative. So we interpret these results as there is not enough evidence that natives moved out of these local labor markets to escape this labor supply shock. In addition, so we also try to have instead of, so both our endogenous variable and our instruments, they have more or less the same. It's not exactly the same because it's predicted, but they have a common denominator. So what we do is we use logs instead of this denominator. We use the log of the repatriates as the instrument, and we control for the log of natives on the right hand side of the equation. Moreover, so our results are also robust if we exclude particular regions. First, we excluded Lisbon, the capital, Setúbal, and the Algarve, the south. So Lisbon and Setúbal were the most affected areas that received the more refugees, are clearly the outliers. And we also removed Algarve because Algarve was a place with very touristic place. It still is, but it was affected by the revolution. There were not that many British people coming to Algarve. And so this could potentially bias the results. And if we remove these three regions, or if we just remove two of them, the results hold. We also removed the rural area of Alentejo, which is comprised by 5 nuts-free regions. Because at this time, there was like an agrarian reform, so that was led by communist movements that expropriated a lot of lands, and there was instability was even higher in this region. And if we remove this area, the results also hold. Then, if we do not have if we do not have regional fixed effects, or if we change the definition of our 5 nuts2 fixed effects, the results also hold. Then we do a lot of exercises trying to show that basically these holds if we change a little bit the sample selection. So including repatriates who change nuts2, which is a small fraction, does not change the result. If we, instead of considering those that were 15 in 74, 75, if we go a little bit up, or if we exclude more older people, the results also are pretty much robust. If we exclude all inactive repatriates, or if we consider only Portuguese-born repatriates, again. We also do shocks at the gender-specific shocks, so considering that male repatriates only affected male natives and female repatriates only affected female repatriates only affected female natives, and the results are also robust, and using natives, as I told you, instead of instrumenting natives as well. So yeah. To conclude,
there is just one question, well, two questions along the same line from the audience. Just how should we interpret the magnitude of the coefficient in terms of economic significance? And so, then, well, you have 5 minutes, but since you are at the conclusion already,
yes, sure. Be good. So these ones, I have to see my notes. I have to see, we have exactly the numbers in the paper. But what we find is that there is about 22% decrease for males. So here, share of employers. Yes, here, the share of employers, considering the share of employers on average per region, this amounts to a reduction for males of about 22%. And so in more affected areas, less 22%, and for females, less half. This is about half of the, this part here in terms of the working as employees, this part here, This is about half of the person if we multiply by the average share, it's about half of the population that was of female natives that were working as employees. Okay. Okay, so let me conclude. So our results are for several years after the inflow. So we are not really measuring short-term effects. We are a little bit like a few years after the shock, seeing what happened. And we do not find increased unemployment for either males or females. But the story is very, very different for both, as we try to argue. So the state support may have given labor market the time to adjust, even support large and to support large inflows of people. Well, this was not for free. So Portugal, not just because of that, but for other reasons, Portugal in 1979 and again in 1983 requested the bailout from the IMF because it was very difficult to keep these expenses. Even though we see in 1981 that the labor market adjusted, but it took a lot from the state to support these people. And we also find that these substantial gender differences. So a much larger displacement effect for females. So males were able to compensate by moving into entrepreneurship, so becoming self-employed, having their own business. But women, they were forced to leave the labor market. And this comes to, in contrast with what Cardoso and Moran have in their paper, that basically Portugal was one of the places in Eastern Europe that had a higher female labor force participation. But we find that with this inflow, this new shock, at least the places with more repatriates were the ones where this massive increase of female labor force participation was more hurt by this influx of people. So thank you so much for your time, and we are looking forward to questions from the audience.
Well, thank you very much, João, for this fascinating presentation. I see there are one question by Kentaro and one by Jeremy in the Q&A. So if you would like, I can just allow you to unmute yourself so you can ask your question directly. Kentaro, you can go ahead.
Hi, João. Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi. Nice to meet you.
I don't know how to turn on the camera, so I speak like this. So can you distinguish the effects on the female labor force participation by their marital status, for example, to see if the effect was simply driven by the husband coming back from Africa, or it was an effect directly on the women through the labor market. Can you distinguish these two mechanisms?
Unfortunately, we cannot. We have the marital, so the share of women that are married, and also other indicators of social change like out of wedlock births and so on. But they are all aggregated at the regional level. So we are planning to look at that, but we are not able to distinguish between males and between repatriates and natives. So we didn't. It's indeed very interesting, and that part could be an important part of the story. But
yeah,
so far we don't know.
Maybe do you know there was an effect on, for example, fertility, number of baby born across
yes, that's also
regions.
These indicators that we gathered that we could potentially look at to see. Again, we do not know if it's the fact that there are a lot of native
at least by regional level, maybe
certain regions that are much more open and less conservative in some well, politically they were conservative but less in attitudes and so on. That could be driving that result. We cannot distinguish for natives and repatriates, but even at the regional level, it could be interesting to have a look. Definitely.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Jeremy, you can go ahead, and then Jem afterwards.
Hi, thanks. This was a really interesting presentation. My question is about, can you distinguish effects by education of natives? And in particular, I'm wondering, who were the men who were shifting into self-employed work, and were these well-educated men or less educated men, and what more do we know about them, just to help to interpret, this finding and what this means?
Yes, that unfortunately our outcomes, we do not have the share of employees per education group or the share of entrepreneurs per education group for the natives. We know that for the repatriates, but not for the natives. Unfortunately, that would also be very interesting to see, but I don't know how we'll deal with that. We are trying to look for more data at the census level, but I'm not sure if it will be possible to distinguish between education groups, unfortunately.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, Jem, you can go ahead.
Okay. Very nice work, João. Two comments. First one is regarding the 1990s. So I had a connection issue, so I might have missed some details, but basically you don't need to distinguish between, well, I mean, I see your point. Okay, now I take it back. You cannot know who is the native. Okay, sorry, I'm going back again. You just need to look at the regional labor market. So you don't need to know who is who. So you just want to see if the labor market has adjusted in 20 years. So that was the comment, and that's what Edo does in the paper. So, okay. And then regarding the, have you looked into native displacement? So that is natives leaving the location as a result of the inflows. This could be interesting for two reasons. First one, it's a mechanism, and you kind of have to look into it now, like with all the new papers. And secondly, you might want to include as a control to make sure that what you capture is not, I don't know, dampened or whatever, aggravated with due to outflows. That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Definitely, we can look at the aggregate level. So we maybe go there to try to see what, but it will be aggregated for both natives and repatriates. Regarding these displacements, what we can argue is that, so we know the place of residence for all these natives between in 79 and in 81. And we know that very few changed places. I don't have the number from the top of my head, but it's a small number. And we also, when we do the exercise at the municipality level instead of at the NUTS 3, we do not find, we find even more negative results, if anything. Some of them are very, very similar, and they are not statistically different from one another, but if anything, they are more negative. So we do not have so we interpret this as not having like a lot of displacement, because if we had a lot of displacement, people would be, so this would somehow attenuate the effect, and because the denominator would change. But if you have if you have more suggestions of what could be done, this part of including this as a control, we have to, because we can see between 79 and 81, so that could maybe be a good way to go. Thank you.
Good. Well, there was a question by Sarah about looking at the outcomes separately by education, but I think you have kind of answered to that already. And then there is a question by Anuj, who you can ask yourself if you would like. Anuj, you can unmute.
Thank you. Yeah, it was mostly a comment. Like, I was curious if the latest definitions of the NUTS 3 regions or the municipalities were taken into account, as in during the course of time, they might have merged regions or like broken down the municipalities into more municipalities. So I was curious if that might change the results to some degree, but I'm pretty sure if you have got it covered, I was just curious.
So there were 3 municipalities being created during these like alpha century, three more municipalities. So in 303. No, it was a little bit, it was 3 like 20 years ago and a little bit more, but not many more. And we are using the first definition of a NUTS 2, so the closest possible to the outcome. Now they have been reduced, so instead of 30 regions, we would move to 27. That we, in the newest definitions of NUTS 3 regions, we have not tried to see if it's robust to this 27 instead of 30, but that's something we can do. Okay, thank you. But we need to be more clear in this part. Okay,
thanks for the presentation. Thank you.
And finally, there is a question by Ana Garcia. Go ahead, Ana. Ana, you should be able to unmute yourself at this point if you want to ask your question. If not, Joel, you can go ahead with your question.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for the presentation. I have a question regarding your identification strategy. I guess the underlying assumption that you have is that absent the repatriates, you would expect to have, let's say, an homogeneous evolution of the local labor markets in Portugal, right?
Homogeneous?
In the sense that you wouldn't, I mean, your identification relies on the fact that absent the variation of the repatriation shock, you wouldn't expect a significant difference in the evolution, let's say, of the labor force participation or the unemployment at the different regional levels, because otherwise you would have a confounding factors, I guess.
Yes, at the regional level, yes.
Yeah, and so I'm just a bit worried about the large time lag that you have between the pre and the post-shock period, namely the pre-shock period being 1960. So what I'm thinking about is the large emigration that Portugal witnessed over these 2 decades, which is likely to have been regionally heterogeneous. So, for example, a huge emigration from the poorer rural areas in the north compared to other more developed regions, let's say surrounding Lisbon. And so I'm just wondering whether the native, so the natives outcome in 81 might actually reflect part of that heterogeneous evolution between 60 and 81, independently of the repatriation shock. Is there anything you can say or do about that?
Yes, that's of course a concern. What we try to do to deal with that is all these robustness checks by excluding particular regions that where these particular concerns of where there was an agrarian reform or the capital Lisbon. And by the way, Lisbon is not the place that received more repatriates. It's a smaller, it's a far more rural area than Lisbon, then another rural area, but then you have Porto, Algarve. So it's not that clustered. So we have a lot of people here, but also in a very rural area. But of course, these concerns are there. This is a period of a lot of instability. For you to have an idea, like in 2 or 3 years, there were like more than 10 governments. So this is a period after revolution. So a lot of things are happening, but they would have to be very much correlated with this shock of the repatriates, which is a huge shock. So it would have to be very much correlated with that, and it would have to survive in a systematic way these robustness checks that we try to do to deal with that.
If I may follow up on that, and Sarah, please stop me whenever I'm taking too much time. So I think to be a bit upfront, I think most of the robustness checks don't address this concern, the concern that I just raised. And if I may add another thing, which kind of amplifies my worriness, is that the emigration to the colonies per se is not independent of the other movements that I was thinking about. So the emigration, you could expect that areas that send more people to the former colonies are also areas that will send more people to France and Germany, for example, right? Areas being less developed. And so that's one thing. And the other thing is that I believe actually that some of your repatriates will be natives in 1960, right? You can't clean the 1960 census of people that move out to the colony. So in the sense that if I'm 20 and I'm working in 1960, I go to Angola, then I do a career in Angola, and then the revolution happens. I'm around 35, 40, and then I get repatriated to Portugal, but I'm still in my active age. So, and that's kind of linked to the problem I'm alluding to, is the question of the composition of the 60s, the dynamics that happened between 60 and 81, and then what you try to measure as an effect of the revolution. So one thing, and I'm thinking out loud here, but one thing I've been thinking about is how much could you try to do using information on cohorts? So the idea being, so for example, you could compare the population, the municipal or the regional population between 1960 and 1981 using specific age, the age distribution of the region. So someone that is 18 in 1960 will be close to 40 in 1981. So you could kind of compare the share of the local population within, let's say, the age of 18 and 30, and the share of population between the ages of 40 and 55, native population of 40 and 55 in the region in 1981. And the difference will be basically the people that died or that emigrated. And there, I guess you could, I mean, if you assume that the mortality is quite homogeneous across the country, which again is an assumption which might not perfectly hold, but that might still be, fair enough. You could have an idea on where this this population, I mean, where the evolution, where you would have most missing natives, basically, in this, and those missing natives might either have moved to the colonies, or basically, no, sorry. So if you add, once you add the repatriates, the missing migrants, the missing natives, sorry, will be migrants that moved to other places, not of the dead people. I don't know if I'm clear. If I'm not, we can, I mean, I'm happy to discuss this later on, because I don't want to monopolize the discussion. But,
yes. So let me jump in, since we're almost running out of time. Maybe we can leave 2 minutes to João to think about the answer. In the meantime, maybe Jasna can conclude, and everybody who wants to continue the discussion can stay on, and then João can answer this question maybe. So Jasna, just you can go ahead and conclude.
Jasna?
We don't hear you.
Yeah, so I was saying that we're happy to have Maria Belgova next week, who will present her paper on the refugee crisis and right-wing populism in Italy, so using an Italian dispersal policy. And so, as you all know, you can see all the upcoming presentations on our website. And we are still receiving and reviewing submissions on a rolling basis. So feel free to send your paper whenever you have one that's ready to our email address. And as you've seen today, there are some panelists. So panelists are those who register before Friday, the week before the seminar. And we normally require or ask of panelists to have read the paper, register early, and come slightly before. So that gives you the chance to interact a little bit more closely to the speaker and the organizers. So I would like to thank you all for having been here today for this really nice presentation. And I hope to see you next week as well.